The schooner Pale Horse cut through the thick fog hanging over the Savannah River on the afternoon of May 2nd, 1767, carrying a cargo of molasses, mahogany, and a woman whose presence would eventually incinerate three of Georgia's most prominent lineages. Captain O'Malley stood rigidly at the helm, his knuckles white against the rail, refusing to look toward the hold where the woman named Amara sat confined. He had overseen the transport of human chattel from Bridgetown to the mainland colonies for 2 decades, yet this specific journey had frayed his nerves into tatters. The crew had refused to enter the lower decks for the last 4 days, citing a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to radiate from her presence. The ship's log, preserved in the Georgia Historical Society archives, notes vaguely that the men reported a disturbance in the air, though the captain had refused to elaborate further. O'Malley knew that whatever spiritual weight this woman carried, it was far denser than the chains binding her wrists. Savannah emerged from the mist like a fever dream, its grid of squares and spires offering a stark contrast to the dark, brooding waters the Pale Horse had traversed. The port was younger than Charleston, lacking the veneer of ancient aristocracy, yet it possessed its own stark, mercantile brutality. On the docks, stevedores and merchants moved with practiced indifference, tallying lives as easily as they tallied barrels of rum or bales of raw cotton. In the ledgers of the Port Authority for that year, the value of incoming human property was calculated with surgical precision, stripped of sentiment or moral hesitation. This city, built upon the labor of the enslaved and the ambitions of the ambitious, presented itself as a rational, organized society, a perfect camouflage for the irrational destruction that Amara would soon unleash. The atmosphere that day was heavy, the humidity pressing down like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that seemed to promise a reckoning. Captain O'Malley watched the dockhands secure the vessel with a desperate hunger for land, his mind already racing toward the tavern where he could drown the memory of the crossing. He had transported nearly 2,000 souls in his career, but the silence of this one had unmanned him in ways that screaming and begging never had. During the 3-week voyage, Amara had not uttered a single syllable, had not wept, and had not flinched when the boards creaked or the waves battered the hull. The ship's surgeon, a man of science who scoffed at sailor superstitions, had reportedly refused to treat her after a single examination, claiming her pulse beat with a slow rhythmic menace that unsettled his very soul. The captain's private journal, auctioned in 1892, contains a single, frantic entry dated April 30th. She watches without eyes. She waits without patience. He could not depart the harbor fast enough. The gangplank slammed onto the wharf with the finality of a judge's gavel, signaling the transfer of possession from the maritime world to the terrestrial one. Waiting at the periphery of the crowd was Silas Vance, a man whose wealth was derived from the rice plantations flanking the Altamaha River, and whose ego was as expansive as his holdings. Vance was not merely a merchant. He was an architect of Savannah's social hierarchy, a man accustomed to bending the will of both men and nature to his design. He checked his pocket watch, a heavy gold piece imported from London, and scanned the deck with predatory calculation. His attention was not on the cargo manifests or the customs officers approaching the ship, but entirely fixed upon the dark figure emerging from the shadows of the companionway, a figure that the city's elite would soon come to fear more than disease or drought. Historical records confirm that Silas Vance had arranged for this specific acquisition months prior, bypassing the standard public auctions to secure what he termed in correspondence a singular specimen of utility and grace. He had purchased her through intermediaries in Barbados, paying a premium to ensure no other buyer in Georgia could claim her. The bill of sale, recorded in the probate records of Chatham County, listed the price as 3,500 pounds sterling, an exorbitant sum that signaled her perceived value, was far beyond that of common field labor. Vance believed that ownership of this woman would secure his family's preeminence over his two primary rivals, the Sterlings and the Crowthorns, cementing the Vance name at the apex of colonial society. He was, as the diaries of his contemporaries noted, a man who viewed people as possessions and possessions as extensions of his own power. Amara descended the gangplank with a fluid, unsettling grace, her bare feet making no sound against the rough-hewn wood of the dock. She wore a simple shift of coarse linen, stained by the voyage, yet she carried herself with the poise of visiting royalty. The shackles on her wrists, iron links forged in a Birmingham foundry, appeared less like constraints and more like jewelry adorning a tragic deity. As she stepped onto the solid earth of the colony, the bustling noise of the waterfront seemed to falter, the rhythm of commerce disrupted by an intangible shift in the atmosphere. Longshoremen paused in their labor, crates suspended in mid-air, as a collective shiver rippled through the throng. It was as if the city itself recognized the arrival of a force it could not categorize or control. A silent storm making landfall. A waiting carriage, its lacquered surface gleaming in the muted sunlight, stood at the end of the pier, the Vance family crest embossed upon its doors in gold leaf. Two enslaved footmen, their eyes cast downward in practiced subservience, held the doors open. The contrast between their downcast posture and Amara's level, unyielding gaze was stark and immediate. She did not require guidance or prodding. She moved toward the vehicle with the certainty of someone who had foreseen this moment long before the ship ever left Bridgetown. Silas Vance stepped forward to meet her, his face a mask of proprietary satisfaction, though a close reading of his expression reveals a flicker of doubt, a tremor of the instinctual fear that the captain had felt. He offered his hand to assist her, a gesture of gentility that masked the iron grip of ownership. As her fingers brushed his, Vance felt a sudden sharp coldness that had nothing to do with the coastal wind. It was a sensation of sliding into an abyss, a momentary vertigo that vanished as quickly as it came. He pulled his hand back, straightening his coat, unwilling to admit to himself that he had been momentarily unmanned. "Take her to the house," he ordered the driver, his voice tighter than he intended. "Prepare the quarters in the attic." He turned to address the customs official approaching with the paperwork, forcing his mind back to the comfortable, tangible world of ledgers and tariffs. But as the carriage pulled away, rattling over the cobblestones of Factor's Walk, Silas Vance remained on the dock, staring at his palm, which still tingled with the ghostly residue of that touch. The carriage moved deeper into the city, passing the raw squares of Johnson and Wright, where the live oaks cast long skeletal shadows across the ground. Inside the darkened cabin, Amara sat opposite a junior member of the Vance household, a clerk tasked with ensuring the new arrival reached the mansion without incident. The young man tried to focus on his manifest, but he found his gaze drawn irresistibly to her face. Her eyes, the color of dark amber, were fixed on the passing buildings, observing the geometry of her new prison with clinical detachment. The clerk would later tell his brother, in a whisper shared over ale, that she did not look like a woman in chains, but like a general surveying a battlefield she had already conquered. Unseen by the crowds or the nervous clerk, Amara's hand moved to the small pocket sewn into the seam of her dress. Inside lay a folded scrap of cloth, containing a single bleached finger bone, not a trinket, but a relic of her mother, severed during the Middle Passage years prior. It was her compass, her anchor to a history that Savannah's brick and mortar sought to erase. She felt the bone's sharp edge press against her skin, a reminder of the debt that spanned generations and oceans. The carriage rattled on toward the Vance mansion on the western edge of the city, carrying a cargo far more volatile than Silas Vance could have possibly imagined. A silent passenger carrying the fire that would soon burn his world to ash. The carriage deposited Amara at the steps of the Lower Market, a sprawling structure of brick and timber, where the city's commerce in human lives intersected with the trade of livestock and provisions. This was the designated point of transfer, a bureaucratic waypoint where private sales were finalized away from the chaotic spectacle of the public auction blocks. The air here was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the sharp tang of raw indigo, a sensory assault that served to dehumanize the merchandise passing through. Yet the usual cacophony of the market, the wailing of the separated and the bellowing of the auctioneers, seemed to dampen as Amara stepped onto the cobblestones. A receipt found in the Vance family papers, dated May 2nd, 1767, confirms the transaction location, noting the transfer of one female named Amara, age approximately 24 years, for the agreed-upon sum, finalizing her entry into the heart of the Georgia elite. Silas Vance stood by the market's heavy doors, flanked by his personal attorney and two burly overseers who kept their eyes averted from the woman they were meant to guard. He was there to ensure that the legalities were unimpeachable, preventing any rival claims from arising before he could spirit her away to his estate. The market clerk, a man named Elias Thorne, fumbled with the ledger, his hands shaking visibly as he recorded the transfer. His diary, discovered years later in an attic on Jones Street, speaks of a heaviness that descended upon the room, a pressure that made the simple act of writing feel like carving stone. Thorne noted that he felt as if he were documenting the arrival of a biblical plague rather than a routine property exchange, a sentiment that would prove remarkably prescient. Just as the clerk prepared to close the ledger, a commotion erupted at the market's entrance, signaling the arrival of forces that would complicate Vance's calculated acquisition. Arthur Sterling, a shipping magnate whose vessels dominated the Savannah to Liverpool route, strode into the hall, his entourage parting the crowd like the prow of a ship. He was a man accustomed to acquiring whatever caught his eye, and rumors of the woman from Barbados had preceded the Pale Horse into the harbor. Sterling's presence was an imposition of will, a declaration that he intended to contest Vance's presumption of ownership. The tension in the room spiked instantly, transforming a mundane commercial transaction into a theater of aristocratic rivalry, with Amara standing silently at the center of the impending storm. Sterling did not bother with pleasantries, bypassing the clerk entirely to address Vance directly, his voice carrying the rasp of a man used to shouting over gales. "I have come to make a counteroffer," Sterling announced, his gaze fixed on Amara with a hunger that bordered on the obscene. "I am prepared to reimburse your expenses and add a premium of £500 sterling for your trouble." The offer was substantial, a deliberate insult wrapped in the language of business, implying that Vance could be bought off like a common haggler. The market crowd, sensing the drama, fell silent, their collective breath held as they watched the two titans of Savannah's economy lock horns over a prize that neither seemed to fully understand. The stakes were rising, the financial numbers climbing as the men postured, oblivious to the true cost. Before Vance could respond, a third voice cut through the tension, belonging to Edward Crowthorne, a planter whose rice fields bordered the Vance holdings to the south. Crowthorne had entered the market unnoticed during the confrontation, positioning himself near the ledger desk. He was a man of quiet, dangerous ambition, and he saw in this moment an opportunity to humiliate both of his competitors. "Your expense reimbursement is an insult, Sterling," Crowthorne said smoothly, checking the cuffs of his lace shirt. "I will offer £1,000 sterling, Cash on the barrel. Right now. The escalation was rapid, the monetary value of Amara's life inflating in seconds to a sum that exceeded the annual income of most colonial merchants. The market had become a gladiatorial arena, though the weapon of choice was currency rather than steel. Silas Vance felt the trap spring shut around him. His pride would not allow him to bow to these men, yet the numbers being bandied about were astronomical. He stepped physically between Amara and his rivals, his face darkening with a mixture of rage and possessiveness. "She is not for sale," Vance spat, his voice trembling not with fear, but with the strain of resisting avarice. "The transaction is complete. The contracts are signed, sealed, and witnessed in Bridgetown." He produced the documents from his satchel, thrusting them toward the clerk as if they were a shield. The legal barrier was the only weapon he had left, and he wielded it with the desperation of a man defending his soul rather than his property. The struggle had moved beyond commerce. It was now a battle for status and dominance. The clerk, Thorne, took the papers with trembling hands, his eyes darting between the three powerful men who loomed over his desk. He scanned the documents, noting the heavy wax seals and the signature of the governor of Barbados, which Vance had procured through considerable expense and influence. "The papers appear to be in order," Thorne squeaked, his voice barely audible in the cavernous hall. "The woman, the property, is legally registered to the household of Silas Vance." The pronouncement should have ended the matter, but the atmosphere remained charged, the air practically vibrating with the thwarted desires of Sterling and Crowthorne. The clerk's pen scratch, marking the final entry, seemed to echo like a gunshot, signaling the end of the skirmish, but the beginning of a much longer war. Arthur Sterling leaned in close, his face inches from Vance's, dropping his voice to a hiss that the crowd strained to hear. "Contracts can be broken, Silas, and fortunes can be lost," he warned, his eyes flicking momentarily to Amara, who watched the exchange with an expression of detached curiosity. "You think you have won a prize, but you have merely made yourself a target." Sterling then turned on his heel and departed, his heavy boots striking the floor with a rhythm that sounded like a funeral march. The threat was not veiled. It was a promise of economic annihilation. The market, usually a place of transaction and transience, now felt like a site of historical record, the first marker in a saga of destruction. Edward Crowthorne offered a different, more insidious reaction. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression that did not reach his eyes. He adjusted his coat and offered a mocking bow to Vance. "Enjoy your purchase, neighbor," Crowthorne said, his tone dripping with false congeniality. "I suspect she will prove to be quite expensive to maintain." With that, he followed Sterling out into the sunlight, leaving Vance standing alone in the suddenly silent market hall. The ease of Crowthorne's retreat was more disturbing than Sterling's aggression, implying a confidence that the issue was far from settled. The rivalry had been cemented, the three families now bound together by a golden thread of obsession that would eventually strangle them all. Vance exhaled a breath he had not realized he was holding, turning to face the object of the conflict. Amara stood exactly where she had been left, motionless as a statue, her amber eyes fixed on the ledger in the clerk's hands. She seemed entirely unmoved by the thousands of pounds sterling that had just been offered for her possession, her detachment a stark counterpoint to the men's hysteria. This passivity was itself a form of power, a mirror reflecting the absurdity of their greed. Vance grabbed her arm roughly, needing to reassert his dominance after the humiliation of the confrontation, and steered her toward the waiting carriage outside. The transaction was complete. The woman was his, but the victory felt hollow, like holding a shard of glass that was already beginning to cut his skin. As they exited into the bright afternoon glare, The market crowd parted before them, the spectators whispering among themselves about the unprecedented scene they had just witnessed. The story of the bidding war would spread through Savannah's taverns and parlors by nightfall, transforming Amara from a simple house slave into a symbol of desire and contention. The seeds of the city's obsession were planted in that moment, watered by the jealousy of the excluded and the pride of the victor. Vance shoved Amara into the carriage, climbing in after her and slamming the door shut, desperate to wall himself off from the eyes of the city. But as the vehicle lurched into motion, he could not escape the feeling that he was the one who had been purchased, and the price was his own ruin. The carriage rattled away from the market square, leaving the prying eyes of the crowd behind as it turned onto the packed dirt road leading toward the Vance estate. Inside the dim cabin, the air grew heavy and stale, charged with an uncomfortable silence that seemed to press against the velvet upholstery. Silas Vance sat across from his acquisition, his fingers drumming a restless, agitated rhythm on his cane. He studied the woman opposite him, searching for some sign of gratitude or submission, but her face remained an impassive mask, her gaze fixed on the shifting landscape through the cracked window curtain. The transaction at the market had been a public victory, yet in this private confines of the carriage, the dynamic of power felt strangely inverted, as if he were the one under scrutiny. Driven by a need to assert his authority, Vance broke the silence, his voice harsh in the cramped space. "You understand your position here?" he stated, framing the words not as a question, but as a command for acknowledgement. "You are a Vance possession now, the finest in the colony." Amara turned her head slowly, her amber eyes catching a sliver of sunlight and reflecting it with an almost metallic sheen. She did not cower or lower her gaze as was custom. Instead, she met his stare with a level of intensity that made the breath catch in his throat. "I understand English, sir," she replied, her voice low and melodic, carrying the crisp diction of the educated class. "And I understand ownership." The simplicity of the statement, devoid of fear or flattery, unsettled him more than a scream would have. Vance shifted in his seat, unnerved by her composure, and sought to test the limits of her history. "The man in Bridgetown, the planter who sold you," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "What ended his tenure?" It was a challenge, a probe into the shadows that had followed her from the Caribbean. Amara did not blink. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect despite the jostling of the carriage wheels. "He found the weight of his affairs too heavy to bear," she said calmly. He sought relief in a barrel of Madeira and a loaded pistol. The matter-of-fact delivery of such a violent image caused Vance to grip his cane tighter, the wood groaning under the pressure of his hand. "And the master before him?" Vance pressed, though a prickle of instinctive warning raced down his spine. He wanted to prove that she was merely lucky, or perhaps cursed in a way that could be managed. Amara tilted her head slightly, as if recalling a distant memory. "He was fond of walking," she said. "One dawn, he walked into the surf until the sea took him. They say the crabs were unkind to his remains." She delivered these horrors with the same inflection one might use to describe the weather, a terrifying neutrality that suggested she had witnessed the unraveling of men so many times that it had become mundane. The carriage seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening despite the afternoon sun. Vance scoffed, a weak attempt to dismiss the chilling accounts as coincidence. "You bring misfortune, then," he sneered, leaning forward to intimidate her. "I am not a superstitious man, Amara. I do not believe in curses or haunts. I believe in discipline and profit." Amara's lips curved into a faint, terrifying smile, the first expression she had shown since leaving the ship. Misfortune is merely the settling of debts, Master Vance, she whispered. And I am merely the bookkeeper. The metaphor struck him with unexpected force, reframing her not as a victim of circumstance, but as an agent of a balancing force he could not comprehend. As the tension in the carriage reached a breaking point, the narrative of her origin began to unspool in Vance's mind, pieced together from the fragments of her testimony and the rumors he had ignored in his greed. She spoke then, unprompted, her voice taking on a distant, rhythmic quality. I was born on the windward coast, she said, before the ships came with their ledgers and chains. She described a mother who had whispered codes into her ear, a language of survival that transcended the physical world. This was not a confession, but a declaration of lineage, positioning her as the scion of a forgotten empire, stolen and reforged in the fires of the Middle Passage. Vance felt the walls of his rational world begin to crumble. She reached into the folds of her dress, withdrawing the small scrap of cloth that Vance had not noticed before. My mother gave me this, she said, her voice dropping to a hush. A piece of bone, from her own hand, severed when they dragged her to the auction block in Barbados. She held the bundle with reverence, a holy relic of a martyr. She told me to remember, to watch, and to wait for the moment when the ledgers must be balanced. The revelation of the talisman was a violation of the unspoken rules of slave ownership. It was an assertion of a separate, superior allegiance that negated his claim of total dominion over her. Vance stared at the cloth bundle, his blood running cold as the implications of her words sank in. He had purchased a woman to elevate his status, but he realized with dawning horror that he had instead imported a vessel of ancient vengeance. The story of her past, the masters dead by their own hands, the whispers of a curse, was not a history of bad luck, but a curriculum vitae of destruction. She was not a servant. She was a slow-acting poison disguised in human form. The carriage, once a symbol of his victory, now felt like a hearse transporting a bomb that was already ticking down. The vehicle lurched violently as it hit a rut in the road, snapping Vance back to the present moment. But Amara did not move. She remained perfectly centered, as if the laws of physics deferred to her will. "Why tell me this?" Vance demanded, his voice cracking. "Why warn me if you intend to destroy me?" He was bargaining with a force he could not see, desperate to find a loophole in the logic of her existence. Amara tucked the bone back into her pocket and smoothed her dress, her expression returning to one of polite indifference. "Because you asked, Master Vance," she replied gently, "and because a man deserves to know the nature of the fire he has brought into his home." She looked out the window again, where the silhouette of the Vance mansion was becoming visible through the trees. "I am not the curse," she added softly. "I am the consequence." The distinction hung in the air, final and absolute. Vance realized then that he could not turn back. To return her would be an admission of defeat, and his pride would not allow it. He was trapped in a trap of his own making. The carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance of the estate, the imposing structure of brick and mortar looming over them. The footmen rushed to open the door, their faces oblivious to the transaction that had just occurred within. Vance stepped out first, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him, and turned to watch Amara descend. She moved with the fluid grace of a queen entering her court, her eyes sweeping over the house that would become her battleground. The silence of the journey had ended, but the true noise, the clamor of a house about to fall, was just beginning. The Vance mansion stood as a monument to calculated excess, its Georgian facade dominating the western approach to the city. But as Amara crossed the threshold, the atmosphere inside seemed to curdle. The entrance hall, A cavernous space lined with imported Italian marble felt unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that settles deep in the bones rather than on the skin. Silas Vance marched her through the corridor, barking orders to the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who watched the new arrival with a mixture of professional suspicion and instinctive dread. The house itself, documented in a 1767 insurance survey as one of the most valuable properties in the colony, felt less like a home and more like a tomb waiting to be sealed. Amara's footsteps made no sound on the stone floor, a silence that seemed to swallow the usually bustling household noise. Mrs. Gable led Amara up the back stairs to a small room in the attic, a space reserved for the most trusted domestic staff, marking a significant elevation in status from the crowded quarters of the field hands. The room was sparse but private, featuring a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the marshes. The housekeeper lingered at the door, ostensibly to provide instructions on daily routines, but in reality, she was unable to tear her gaze away from the new servant. "You will rise at dawn," Mrs. Gable instructed, her voice wavering slightly. "You will serve the morning meal. You will be invisible." Amara turned from the window, her amber eyes locking onto the older woman. "Invisibility is a useful skill," she replied softly. "I have practiced it for years." Left alone, Amara moved to the small mirror above the washstand, gazing into her own reflection with an intensity that seemed to ripple the air. The glass, a luxury in the colonies, began to fog over, despite the warmth of the day, obscuring her face. From the pocket of her dress, she withdrew the small scrap of cloth containing her mother's finger bone, pressing it against the glass surface. The action was not a prayer of desperation, but a ritual of alignment, a way to anchor her purpose to the physical structure of the house. She whispered a name not her own, but one that sounded ancient and jagged, a word of power from a language that predated the English ledgers and Spanish moss. Meanwhile, in the master study downstairs, Silas Vance attempted to drown the unease of the carriage ride in a decanter of French brandy. He sat at his heavy oak desk, shuffling through stacks of bills of lading and plantation reports, but the numbers blurred before his eyes. The confrontation at the market, combined with Amara's chilling candor, had lodged a splinter of anxiety in his mind that he could not extract. He found himself glancing repeatedly at the door, half expecting it to open on its own. The house sounded wrong. The usual settling of timber and the distant clatter of the kitchen were muted, replaced by a rhythmic, almost inaudible pulse that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The psychological siege of the household began that very first evening. During dinner, Amara served the family with a mechanical precision that bordered on the uncanny, her movements fluid and silent. Julian Vance, the son and heir, sat at the table picking at his food, his eyes drawn irresistibly to the woman who moved behind his father's chair. He was a young man of delicate constitution, prone to nervous fits, and the sight of Amara seemed to agitate his senses. "She does not look like the others," he murmured to his mother, Eleanor, who sat rigidly at the foot of the table. "She does not look away." Eleanor hushed him sharply, but the mother's own hands trembled around her silverware, betraying her own discomfort. By the third week of May, the internal dynamic of the mansion had shifted visibly. The domestic staff began to report strange minor occurrences that defied logical explanation. Silverware found tarnished overnight, the scent of smoldering sugar drifting through the hallways, and the persistent sensation of being watched in empty rooms. A letter from a visiting cousin, preserved in the Vance family correspondence, mentions that the house felt burdened, as if the very air had grown heavy with an unspoken accusation. Silas Vance, usually a man of rigorous discipline, began to drink earlier in the day his temper fraying at the edges as he tried to maintain his facade of control against an enemy he could not strike or shout down. The tension escalated one humid afternoon when Amara was tasked with dusting the library. Silas entered the room, finding her standing before a portrait of his father, the founder of the family fortune. She was not cleaning. She was staring intently at the painted eyes, her expression unreadable. "Get on with your work," Vance snapped, stepping closer to assert his dominance. Amara turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over him before she spoke. "He looks afraid," she said calmly, gesturing to the portrait. Did he know what was coming? The question was innocently phrased, yet it struck at the heart of Vance's own insecurities about his legacy, implying that his empire was built on a foundation of fear that was ready to crumble. Unbeknownst to the master of the house, Amara was already establishing lines of communication that extended beyond the estate's walls. She had identified Samuel, the kitchen boy, who made daily trips to the market, as a conduit. One morning, she pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand, a note written in a script so fine it looked like spider silk. It was addressed to a contact in the northern colonies, a woman in Boston who served a similar function within a merchant household. The network was real, documented in fragments of intercepted correspondence found decades later, and Amara was activating her place within it. The note contained no names, only a confirmation. The house is breached. The waiting is over. The escalating strangeness began to affect the physical environment in ways that the household staff could no longer ignore. Mrs. Gable reported to Silas that the mirrors in the main parlor had developed a persistent cloudiness that no amount of polishing could remove, as if a fine ash had settled on the inside of the glass. Even more disturbing, the grandfather clock in the foyer, a timepiece renowned for its accuracy, began to lose time in erratic jumps, losing hours only to gain them back when no one was listening. The disruption of time itself was a psychological blow to a household obsessed with schedules and efficiency, signaling that the natural order had been suspended. Silas Vance stood in the foyer late one night, watching the pendulum of the defective clock swing erratically. He was exhausted, his nerves frayed by weeks of subtle warfare. He knew, with a certainty that defied his rational mind, that this was her doing, though he could prove nothing. Amara had been in the house less than a month, and already the foundations were shaking. He climbed the stairs to his bed, but as he passed the attic door, he paused. He could feel her presence on the other side of the wood, not sleeping, but waiting with a patience that felt geological in scale. The realization settled over him like a shroud. He had not bought a servant. He had invited a siege engine into his sanctuary. The social event of the season commenced on the evening of June 12th, 1767, as the Vance family threw open their doors to celebrate the king's birthday with a gala designed to solidify their position at the apex of Savannah society. The mansion blazed with light, hundreds of beeswax candles reflecting off the gilded moldings and the anxious faces of the city's elite. Invitations had been extended to every family of note, including the Sterlings and the Crowthorns, a calculated gamble by Silas Vance to display his new acquisition and his unshakable confidence. However, the atmospheric pressure inside the ballroom felt stifling, a heavy, humid stillness that no amount of fanning could dispel. The guests arrived in a procession of silk and powdered wigs, but beneath the veneer of civility, the air crackled with the anticipation of a coming storm. Amara moved through the festivities like a shadow, balancing a silver tray of crystal flutes with a steadiness that belied the chaos she was slowly cultivating. To the unobservant eye, she was merely another high-status servant, but the guests found their gaze drawn to her with an alarming frequency. Men paused mid-sentence to watch her pass, their eyes tracking the fluid grace of her movements, while women clutched their fans tighter, sensing a threat they could not articulate. The silence that followed her path was distinct, a vacuum in the noisy hum of the party. It was as if the room itself held its breath whenever she drew near, the collective subconscious of the attendees recognizing a predator in their midst. Arthur Sterling arrived late, his entrance marked by a dramatic flourish of his walking stick and a loud greeting to the host. He had spent the weeks since the market acquisition seething in silent rage, his pride wounded by Silas Vance's refusal to sell. When he spotted Amara serving near the French doors, his composure instantly fractured. He abandoned his wife on the arm of a lieutenant and strode across the ballroom floor, ignoring the polished social etiquette that usually governed such events. Sterling intercepted Amara near the punch bowl, his hand shooting out to grasp her wrist, a violation of the strict boundaries between guest and property. "I must have a moment of your time," he hissed, his face flushed with drink and desire. Silas Vance, observing from the mezzanine, felt a surge of protective fury, though it was born of possessiveness rather than chivalry. He descended the stairs rapidly, inserting himself between Sterling and the servant. "Unhand my property, Arthur," Vance commanded, his voice low but trembling with forced authority. "This is a celebration, not a market stall." The confrontation drew immediate attention, the nearby guests pretending to converse while straining to hear the conflict. Sterling released Amara's wrist, but stepped closer to Vance, his eyes wild. "Name your price tonight, Silas," he whispered intensely. "I am prepared to offer 5,000 pounds sterling, right here, right now." Before Vance could respond to the audacious offer, Edward Crewthorne materialized from the crowd, his sudden presence acting as a catalyst for the escalating chaos. He had been watching the exchange with a predatory smile, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 5,000 is an insult for such a prize," Crowthorne announced loudly, causing heads to turn across the ballroom. "I will offer 7,000 pounds sterling, and I will throw in my sloop, the Sea Nymph, which is worth another 2,000. The mention of such astronomical figures, 9,000 pounds total, sent a ripple of shock through the assembly. The bidding war was no longer a private dispute, but a public scandal. The veneer of high society crumbled completely as other men, sensing the blood in the water, began to shout their own interest. A minor planter from the southern counties offered 6,000, while a merchant with shipping interests in the Caribbean screamed a figure that was drowned out by the rising din. The gala had devolved into a frenzied auction, the sophisticated guests transforming into a pack of baying hounds fighting over a bone. Silas Vance stood in the center of the vortex, his face pale, realizing that his attempt to display his power had instead exposed his vulnerability. The woman behind him remained motionless, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance, as if the frenzy of men bidding for her life was beneath her notice. Eleanor Vance, the matriarch, rushed to her husband's side, her face a mask of mortified terror. "Silas, stop this," she pleaded, gripping his arm. "We are being ruined." But Silas was paralyzed by the mechanics of the market he usually controlled so well. To sell now would be to admit defeat, but to hold was to invite a siege he might not survive. The shouting grew louder, the offers climbing to 10,000 pounds, then 12,000, sums that exceeded the annual revenue of the entire colony. The madness was contagious, infecting the room with a feverish need to possess what everyone else desired, regardless of the cost or consequence. In the midst of the hysterical crowd, Julian Vance, the sensitive heir, began to laugh. It was a high, brittle sound that cut through the shouting, causing the nearest guests to recoil. "Look at you!" he cried out, pointing at Sterling and Crowthorne. "You are fighting over your own destruction?" His voice cracked with hysteria. the pressure of Amara's presence finally shattering his fragile mind. He staggered toward the center of the room, his eyes wide and rolling. "Can you not see the fire? Can you not see that she is burning us?" The outburst halted the bidding for a moment, the guests staring at the mad son rather than the silent woman. Silas grabbed his son by the shoulders, shaking him violently to silence the prophecy. "Get him out of here!" he ordered the footman, his voice cracking. The interruption broke the spell of the bidding war, but the damage was irrevocable. The gala ended not with a toast to the king, but with the hasty departure of guests fleeing the scene of the social catastrophe. The whispers started immediately, carried on the night air as carriages rattled away, tales of a woman worth a fortune and a family teetering on the edge of insanity. As the last guest departed and the doors were sealed, the silence that descended upon the mansion was heavier than before. Amara stood alone in the center of the deserted ballroom, surrounded by the detritus of the failed celebration, half-empty glasses and dropped fans. She picked up a discarded invitation, glancing at the date. The first public fracture had occurred exactly as she had anticipated. The competition for her ownership had now become a matter of public record and lethal obsession. The night had cost the Vance family their dignity, but it had purchased Amara the exact leverage she required to begin dismantling the walls. She walked slowly toward the stairs, passing Silas, who sat slumped on the bottom step, his head in his hands. He did not look up as she passed, unable to meet the gaze of the woman who had just bankrupted his reputation with her mere presence. The gala was over, but the real event, the unraveling of 3 dynasties, had only just begun its first act. The stakes had been raised to a lethal height, and the debts were coming due. The humiliation of the gala festered in the Vance household, poisoning the already stagnant air. In the days following the aborted bidding war, Julian Vance retreated from the public eye, locking himself in his bedchamber on the 2nd floor. He refused food and drink, his mind unable to process the chaotic visions that had assaulted him during the party. The household staff reported hearing him pacing incessantly, the rhythmic creak of floorboards serving as a grim metronome counting down the family's dissolution. His decline was not merely a symptom of personal frailty, but a direct manifestation of the psychological siege Amara had initiated. A crack in the foundation that threatened to bring the entire edifice crashing down. On a humid afternoon in late June, Amara was tasked with bringing a tray of biscuits and tea to the heir's room, a chore the other servants had begun to avoid with superstitious dread. She ascended the stairs with her characteristic silence, the silver tray balanced perfectly in her hands. When she pushed open the heavy oak door, the room was stiflingly hot, the windows shuttered against the sunlight. Julian sat on the edge of his bed, his shirt unlaced, his eyes wide and rimmed with red. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, the madness in his gaze seemed to focus into terrible clarity. "You are the fire," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You are the fire that burns the old wood." Amara set the tray down on a small table, her movements deliberate and calm, ignoring the accusatory tremor in his voice. She did not deny his statement. Instead, she turned to face him fully, allowing him to see the weight of history in her eyes. "You have the sight, Master Julian," she replied softly. "It is a curse to see the truth, is it not? To see the blood drying on the bricks." She spoke of the foundations of the house, of the labor and death that had built the Vance fortune, things a servant should never acknowledge. Her words were not a comfort, but a validation of his worst fears, confirming that his hallucinations were, in fact, the unmasking of reality. Julian staggered to his feet, stumbling backward until his shoulders hit the wall. He clutched his head, trying to block out the images she was projecting into his mind. Visions of the auction block in Barbados, the drowning of the planter in the surf, the pistol flash in the chapel. "Why do you not run?" he cried out, tears streaming down his face. "Why do you not flee this house?" He was pleading with her, offering her an escape if it would only stop the noise in his head. He saw her not as property, but as an inevitable force, a tidal wave that he was powerless to stop. Amara took a step closer, her voice dropping to a hush that seemed to fill the entire room. "Run?" she asked, the word sounding foreign on her tongue. "There is nowhere to run to, Master Julian. This is not a location, it is a condition." She explained, with terrifying gentleness, that the debt was not specific to the Vance house, but was owed by the entire structure of the world he inhabited. She warned him that the collapse was inevitable, that his father's pride and the other men's greed had already sealed their fates. "The fire comes for all who dwell in the house of lies," she intoned, her eyes locked onto his soul. The confrontation broke something essential within Julian's psyche. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in surrender to the madness that had been nipping at his heels for weeks. He began to scratch at the floorboards, his nails splintering against the wood, trying to dig a hole to escape the flames he now constantly felt licking at his skin. The scene, later reconstructed from the physical damage to the room, painted a picture of a mind that had been pushed past the brink of endurance. Amara stood over him, watching his disintegration not with malice, but with the cold detachment of an executioner observing the fall of the axe. She eventually left the room, locking the door from the outside and pocketing the key, a bold assertion of authority over the master's son. She descended the stairs to find Silas Vance in his study, nursing a glass of rum. "The young master is unwell," she reported, her voice steady and devoid of emotion. "He is fighting demons that the physicians cannot treat." Silas looked up, his eyes bleary, and for the first time, he seemed to shrink away from her presence. He did not question her assessment. The sounds of his son's wailing were beginning to drift down the staircase, a mournful soundtrack to the family's ruin. The horror of the situation escalated rapidly over the following week. Julian's condition deteriorated from melancholia to outright mania. He was found one morning in the garden, tearing at the earth with his bare hands, screaming that the soil was bleeding and that the roots of the magnolia trees were choking the life out of the house. The local physician, a Dr. Hawthorne, was summoned, and his journal entry from July 2nd, 1767, describes the heir as suffering from a nervous fever of the most violent sort, induced by an unknown melancholic agent. The doctor prescribed laudanum and leeches, but the treatments were as effective as trying to stem a tide with a sieve. The household staff, already on edge, began to whisper that the heir was not merely sick, but cursed. They crossed themselves when Amara passed, recognizing the correlation between her proximity and the boy's suffering. The other slaves avoided the second floor entirely, claiming the air there had turned bitter, and that shadows moved without light to cast them. The disintegration of the air served a dual purpose. It removed the future of the Vance line, and it demoralized the patriarch, Silas, who watched his legacy unravel before his eyes. Silas Vance began to drink heavily, retreating into a stupor to escape the sound of his son's screams. He started to avoid Amara, leaving orders with Mrs. Gable rather than addressing the woman directly. He had realized, too late, that he was trapped in a prison of his own making, guarded by a woman he owned but could not control. The bidding war at the gala had been a public display of weakness, and his son's madness was the private consequence. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and the mansion at the edge of the city was no longer a home, but a mausoleum awaiting its occupants. The forced removal of Julian Vance to the Georgia Infirmary for the Insane, a grim institution on the outskirts of the city, marked the definitive end of the family's future and the deepening of the patriarch's isolation. As the carriage bearing the screaming heir pulled away from the house, Amara stood on the portico, watching the departure with a serene expression. The first life had been effectively harvested, though not extinguished. Julian Vance would live, but as a hollow shell, a testament to the fragility of the mind when confronted with the weight of its own complicity. The silence that followed the carriage was deafening, marking the end of the family's future and the deepening of the patriarch's isolation. The trap was now fully set for the remaining players in the drama. Arthur Sterling's decline following the King's birthday gala was as rapid as it was undignified, documented through the increasingly frantic entries in his shipping logs and personal correspondence. By the first week of July, 1767, the magnate who had once commanded a fleet of 12 merchant vessels found himself unable to leave his townhouse on Johnson Square. He sat for hours in his study, staring at the wall maps of the Caribbean trade routes, but his mind was not on the price of sugar or molasses. It was consumed entirely by the memory of a woman's amber eyes. His business partners, the Habersham brothers, noted in a letter dated July 5th that Sterling had neglected to sign 3 critical contracts, leaving shipments of indigo rotting on the docks, a dereliction of duty that threatened to bankrupt the enterprise. The obsession took a physical toll on the merchant, transforming his robust frame into a gaunt, trembling shadow of its former self. He refused food, claiming it tasted of ash, and slept only in fits, waking with screams that terrified the household staff. Sterling had tried to buy the woman at the market with £5,000 sterling, a fortune by any standard, but the rejection had calcified into a malignant fixation. He began to write letters to Silas Vance, missives that grew increasingly unhinged, alternately threatening legal action and pleading for a private viewing. These documents, sealed with the Sterling crest and later seized by creditors, serve as a forensic record of a mind unraveling under the weight of a desire it could not comprehend or control. One sweltering afternoon, Sterling decided that negotiation was no longer an option. He would appeal directly to the source of his torment. He ordered his carriage to take him to the Vance estate, ignoring the protests of his physician who warned that the heat would kill him. The journey was a blur of feverish hallucinations, the trees lining the road twisting into shapes that seemed to mock him. When the carriage halted before the mansion, Sterling stumbled out, his fine coat stained with sweat, his hair hanging in lank strings around his face. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a beggar seeking alms, his dignity stripped away by the invisible acid of Amara's influence. He pounded on the heavy front door, his fists bruising against the wood, shouting Silas Vance's name with a hoarse desperation. The door did not open immediately, but the curtains on the second floor twitched, and Sterling felt the distinct sensation of being watched by a predator hidden in the tall grass. When the butler finally appeared, he did not usher the guest inside. Instead, he delivered a terse message from the master of the house. "Mr. Vance is not receiving visitors," the butler intoned, his eyes averted. Sterling grabbed the servant's lapels, shaking him with a strength born of madness. "Tell him I will give him my fleet!" he screamed. "Tell him I will sign over every ship I own for 1 hour with her." The commotion drew Silas Vance to the door, his face a mask of weary contempt. He looked at his former rival, a man who had once been his equal in power and prestige, now reduced to a raving lunatic on his doorstep. "Go home, Arthur," Vance said, his voice devoid of pity. "You are making a spectacle of yourself." But Sterling was beyond reason. He fell to his knees in the dirt, tearing at his cravat as if it were strangling him. "I cannot eat. I cannot sleep," he wept, his tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "She is in my blood, Silas. I need her, or I will die." Inside the hallway, unseen by the men at the door, Amara stood in the shadows. She did not speak or move to intervene. She merely watched, her expression one of clinical detachment. The collapse of Arthur Sterling was not a tragedy to be mourned, but a calculation to be finalized. Her presence, even from a distance, seemed to amplify the man's distress. As she shifted slightly, the sunlight caught her eyes, and Sterling, as if sensing the movement, turned his head wildly toward the darkened interior of the house. "I see you," he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the void. "I know what you are. You are the devil's own justice." The accusation hung in the humid air, a truth too raw for the daylight. Vance slammed the door in Sterling's face, the heavy thud echoing across the portico like a gunshot. The rejection was final, severing the last thin thread of Sterling's sanity. He remained on his knees for a long moment, staring at the wood grain of the door, before rising slowly and turning back toward his carriage. His driver, a man named Thomas, who had served the Sterling family for 2 decades, later testified that his master's eyes were entirely empty, as if the soul had already departed the body, leaving only a hollow shell behind. Sterling returned to his townhouse a ruined man, his mind fractured beyond repair. That night, he wandered the halls of his mansion, reportedly speaking to empty rooms as if they were filled with the ghosts of the enslaved people he had traded over the years. The household was woken at dawn by a crash from the study. Upon investigation, they found the merchant dead on the floor. The coroner's report, filed on July 10, 1767, listed the cause of death as heart failure, but the servants whispered a darker tale. They said he had been clawing at his own chest, trying to rip out a heart that he believed had turned to stone. The funeral of Arthur Sterling was a muted affair, attended by creditors and curious onlookers rather than genuine mourners. The Sterlings had lost their fortune and their patriarch in the span of a few short weeks. Silas Vance stood by the grave, his face pale, acutely aware that he was standing at the edge of a pit that was slowly expanding to swallow him as well. The rivalry between the two men, once a game of chess played with ships and currency, had ended in a checkmate of death. Silas clutched his coat tighter against a sudden chill, realizing that the woman in his attic was not merely a curse, but a contagion. Rumors began to circulate through Savannah with the speed of a tropical fever. The story of the bidding war, the madness of the heir, and the sudden death of the merchant formed a narrative that was impossible to suppress. People began to cross the street rather than walk past the Vance mansion, and the name of Amara was spoken in hushed tones, a synonym for doom. The collapse of the Sterling house was the first domino to fall, a clear signal that the old rules of commerce and society no longer applied. The city held its breath, waiting to see who would be the next to succumb to the amber gaze. The financial devastation of the Sterling family was absolute. With the fleet sold off to cover debts and the townhouse seized by the bank, the name was effectively erased from the rolls of the city's elite. Yet, in the middle of this ruin, Amara continued her duties at the Vance mansion, dusting furniture that would soon belong to no one, and polishing silver that would soon be melted down. She was the eye of the storm, a calm center of destruction, and as she wiped a smudge from a crystal goblet, she allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The first debt had been collected, but the ledger was far from balanced. With the Sterling line effectively extinguished, and the Vance heir confined to an asylum, the weight of Savannah's predatory gaze shifted entirely to Edward Crowthorne. He was a man who prided himself on rationality, believing that the chaos consuming his rivals was a result of their own emotional weakness. On July 14, 1767, he arrived at the Vance estate with a final, desperate proposal. His carriage was laden with chests containing 16,000 pounds sterling in gold coin, a sum intended to break Silas Vance's resolve and secure the object that had become the sole focus of his waking thoughts. Crowthorne's fingers trembled as he counted the coins in his mind, a nervous tic he could not conceal, signaling that his own facade of control was beginning to fissure. Silas Vance received his rival in the drawing room, a space that now felt perpetually cold despite the oppressive summer heat. The master of the house looked like a ghost of his former self, his skin sallow and his clothes hanging loosely on a frame that had lost the appetite for living. Crowthorne did not bother with pleasantries. He slapped a deed onto the table between them. "This is the title to the Altamaha plantation," he announced, his voice strained. 2,000 acres of prime rice land, plus the 16,000 in gold. I am offering you a king's ransom, Silas. Take it. The monetary value was obscene, enough to purchase a small country, yet it hung in the air like a bribe to the devil. Vance stared at the documents, his eyes devoid of the greed that would have once defined him. He had watched Arthur Sterling die of obsession and his own son fall into madness. He knew that the gold Crowthorne offered was not currency, but a down payment on his own destruction. "You do not understand what she is," Vance whispered, his voice cracking. "She is not a possession to be bought. She is a judgment." He pushed the deed back across the table, his hand shaking. "The answer is no, Edward. For the last time, no." The refusal was absolute, but it lacked the triumph of victory. It was the hollow defiance of a man already condemned. Crowthorne's composure shattered, the veneer of the rational man peeling away to reveal the desperation beneath. "I will have her," he shouted, standing up so abruptly that his chair clattered to the floor. "I will take her by force if I must. You cannot keep a wall between the tide and the shore forever, Silas." He stormed out of the room, leaving the gold chests behind in his haste, a bizarre monument to his failure. Vance sat alone in the silence, the untouched fortune on the table, mocking the very concept of wealth. The siege was no longer financial. It had become a war of attrition, and Crowthorne was preparing to lay waste to the fortress. That evening, as the heat lightning flickered over the marshes, Crowthorne made his way back to the Vance mansion, bypassing the front entrance and slipping into the gardens through a gap in the hedge. He moved with the furtive intent of a thief, guided by a madness that whispered he could claim what gold had failed to buy. He found Amara in the kitchen garden, gathering herbs under the light of a crescent moon. She did not startle at his appearance. She straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands, and turned to face him. The moonlight caught her eyes, turning them into pools of liquid gold, and Crowthorne felt his breath catch in his throat, not with desire this time, but with a primal, instinctive fear. "I have offered everything," Crowthorne said, his voice trembling as he stepped closer. "My land, my fortune, my name. Why will he not sell?" He was pleading with her, begging for a logic that would explain his undoing. Amara regarded him with a calm that was more terrifying than any display of anger. "You offer paper and metal," she said softly. "But you have not offered the only currency that matters here." When Crowthorne asked what that currency was, she smiled, a sad, terrible expression that seemed to age him a decade in a single glance. "You must pay with the truth of what you are." She began to speak then, her voice low and rhythmic, stripping away the layers of justification Crowthorne had built around his life. She spoke of the overseers he had hired to whip the field hands, of the families he had separated on the auction block to balance his books, of the cruel efficiency with which he had built his empire. She did not accuse him. She simply listed the facts, each word a hammer blow against the glass house of his ego. Crowthorne staggered back, clutching his head as the weight of his own history descended upon him. He tried to deny her words, to summon his lawyers and his ledgers to defend himself, but the defenses of civilization crumbled before the raw reality of his sins. "You think you desire me?" Amara continued, stepping closer until she stood within arm's reach. "But you do not want a woman. You want absolution. You want the power to forgive yourself for the blood you have walked through." She reached out and touched his hand, a gesture that burned like ice. "I cannot give you that. I can only show you the mirror." The contact broke something inside him. Crowthorne fell to his knees in the dirt, not in worship, but in collapse. The ambition that had driven him for 40 years evaporated, leaving him hollowed out, a husk of the man who had once commanded the rice fields. "Go!" Amara commanded, her voice hardening to steel. "Leave Savannah tonight. Leave your wife, your house, your gold. Run as far as the continent will allow, and never speak your name again. It is the only way to escape the fire." She offered him a choice that was not truly a choice: exile or death. Crowthorne looked up at her, his eyes swimming with tears of terror and recognition. He saw in her not a prize to be won, but the inevitable consequence of a life lived without conscience. He nodded slowly, the fight draining out of him completely. Crowthorne fled the garden, running blindly through the shadows toward the river. He did not return to his mansion to pack. He did not say goodbye to his wife or his business partners. He walked straight to the docks and boarded a northbound packet ship, paying for passage with the coins he happened to have in his pocket. The crew later reported that the man seemed to be fleeing the devil himself, refusing to speak or eat for the duration of the voyage. He vanished into the anonymity of the northern colonies, leaving behind a fortune and a reputation that would be dismantled by creditors within the month. The third pillar of Savannah's elite had been toppled not by a blade, but by a truth he could not bear to carry. Amara watched him go, the silence of the garden settling back around her like a cloak. The immediate conflict was over, the trio of antagonists neutralized by their own fatal flaws. She turned back toward the house, her gaze drifting to the third-floor window where Silas Vance was undoubtedly watching. The final act was approaching, and the house that had served as the stage for this drama was now the only prop remaining to be struck. She tucked the small cloth bundle back into her pocket, her fingers brushing the bone inside, a reminder that the debt was nearly paid. The night air was heavy with the smell of smoke, though no fire had yet been lit. The night of July 15th, 1767, brought a storm to Savannah that local diarists described as apocalyptic. A tempest of lightning and wind that seemed to target the city's hubris with surgical precision. Inside the Vance mansion, the air had turned toxic, heavy with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of approaching destruction. Silas Vance sat alone in his study, surrounded by the wreckage of his business life. Foreclosure notices and letters of credit denied were scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. The disappearance of Crowthorne and the death of Sterling had not elevated him as he had once hoped. Instead, they had left him as the sole remaining target of a scrutiny he could no longer withstand. The house groaned against the wind, the timbers protesting a burden they were never meant to carry. Eleanor Vance had retreated to her chambers hours earlier, refusing to acknowledge the storm or the strange silence of the servants. She had ceased eating, her mind retreating into a protective delusion that her son would recover and her husband's fortunes would return. But the sound that cut through the thunder at midnight was not natural. It was the distinct, sharp crack of splintering wood from the direction of the library. A footman, roused from his pallet in the hall, later testified that he saw a flicker of orange light dance across the wall paneling, a living shadow that moved against the draft. The fire had begun, not in the hearth, but in the very heart of the house, igniting the dry rot that had been eating away at the Vance legacy for months. Silas Vance emerged from his study to find the main hallway filling with smoke, the thick black clouds rolling along the ceiling like a dark tide. He did not run for water or order an evacuation. Instead, he stood rooted to the spot, staring at the flames as they licked the edges of the imported wallpaper. The insurance investigations later speculated that the fire was caused by a knocked-over oil lamp, a common accident in a house of such age. However, the physical evidence told a stranger story. The fire had started in 3 separate locations simultaneously, a statistical impossibility that the authorities conveniently ignored in their report. Silas watched the combustion with a sense of detached relief, recognizing the flames as the inevitable conclusion to the bargain he had made the day he purchased Amara. The chaos erupted as the fire breached the floorboards, sending showers of sparks into the staircase. Servants scrambled through the smoke, shouting for water buckets that were too few and too small to matter. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was seen trying to rouse Mrs. Vance, pounding on the locked bedroom door with fists that were already blackened by soot. "The house is lost," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. But the door remained barred, and from within came only the sound of sobbing, a prayer in French that rose above the crackling roar. The structure was dying, and its inhabitants were trapped within the narrative of their own demise, unable to step off the stage before the curtain fell. Amara moved through the inferno with a purpose that defied the panic around her. She was seen briefly on the second-floor landing, her figure calm against the backdrop of burning drapery. 2 of the kitchen staff called out to her, urging her to flee the collapsing east wing, but she did not heed them. Her destination was not an exit, but the attic room where she had first established her dominion over the house. The flames parted around her like a curtain, and for a moment, the witnesses claimed her skin did not even glisten with sweat, as if the fire recognized her as its master rather than its victim. She entered the small room and closed the door, vanishing into the heart of the blaze. The collapse of the main staircase severed the connection between the upper floors and the ground, trapping Eleanor Vance in her chambers. The fire consumed the house with a voracious speed, fueled by the decades of varnish and dust that coated every surface. By the time the city's volunteer fire brigade arrived with their hand-pumped engine, the mansion was beyond saving. The water they sprayed turned to steam before it could touch the flames, hissing in protest against the heat. The neighbors stood huddled in the rain, watching the spectacle with a mixture of horror and vindictive fascination, seeing in the destruction a divine judgment on the house that had dared to challenge the natural order. When the roof finally caved in, it did so with a sound like a dying giant, a thunderous crash that sent a plume of sparks spiraling into the stormy sky. Silas Vance was found near the garden wall, not fleeing, but sitting on a bench with his head in his hands, seemingly oblivious to the heat that singed the hair on his arms. He was not burned, yet he looked more damaged than any survivor of the flames. He repeated a single phrase to the constable who tried to question him. "The ledger is closed." The statement was recorded in the police blotter, a cryptic epitaph for a man who had lost everything he had tried to steal. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a gray, sodden landscape dominated by the smoking skeleton of the Vance estate. The brick walls still stood, blackened and hollow, framing a void where a dynasty had once ruled. Firefighters sifting through the debris found 2 bodies in the ruins of the master bedroom, presumed to be Eleanor, and a maid who had refused to leave her side. They were unrecognizable, reduced to char and bone by the intensity of the heat. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as accidental asphyxiation, a bureaucratic closure to a mystery that would haunt Savannah for generations. The most profound mystery, however, was the absence of a third body. Despite the intense heat that had fused the silverware into slag and melted the glass of the windows, Amara was nowhere to be found. A search of the wreckage revealed her attic room, or what remained of it. The door was still locked from the inside. The key melted into the lock mechanism, yet the room was empty. There was no trace of human remains, not even a fragment of bone or a clump of hair. It was as if she had evaporated into the smoke, leaving behind only a scorch mark on the floor in the shape of a hand. The official investigation into the fire lasted 3 weeks, hampered by the lack of witnesses and the sheer destruction of the scene. No charges were ever filed, as the only surviving owner, Silas Vance, had been rendered catatonic by the event and could offer no testimony. He was eventually committed to the same asylum that housed his son, leaving the ruins to be claimed by the bank and sold for a fraction of its value. The debris was cleared away, but the foundation stones were left untouched, a scar on the landscape that the grass refused to grow over. The Vance legacy was reduced to a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of pride and the volatility of property that refuses to be possessed. In the weeks that followed, a strange rumor began to circulate among the enslaved population of Savannah. They whispered that the fire had not killed the woman, but had purified her, freeing her from the flesh to become a spirit of vengeance. Others claimed she had walked out of the front door in the confusion, wearing the smoke like a cloak, and boarded a ship bound for the Caribbean. The legend grew with each retelling, transforming Amara from a slave into a force of nature, a creature that could not be burned or buried. The fire had consumed the Vance house, but it had not extinguished the dead. It had merely scattered the embers to the wind, waiting for the next spark to catch. 4 years passed, and the scorched earth of the Vance estate remained a blight upon Savannah's western approach, a patch of ground where the grass grew in twisted, stunted knots. The city, driven by an relentless economic ambition, sought to bury the memory of the fire beneath new construction and expanding trade routes. Yet, the 3 voids left by the ruined mansions of the Vance, Sterling, and Crowthorne families served as silent monuments to the events of 1767. In the counting houses and taverns, the story of the Amber-Eyed Witch had transitioned from a scandalous headline into a whispered legend, a ghost story used to frighten new apprentices and remind the old money that their power was fragile, built upon a foundation that could crumble at the touch of a single determined hand. In the spring of 1771, a merchant vessel docked in New Orleans, a city whose complex web of Spanish, French, and African traditions offered a fertile ground for seeds of retribution. A wealthy sugar planter named Henri Duval purchased a household servant from a Caribbean trader, paying 6,000 livres for a woman listed on the manifest as Anne. She was described in the bill of sale as educated, docile, and possessing a singular beauty, a set of attributes that raised no suspicion among the bureaucrats who processed the transaction. However, the enslaved community in the city, those who still practiced the old religions in secret, recognized a different kind of signature in her step. They noted that she did not sweat in the humid heat, and that the stray dogs of the city followed her at a respectful distance. Within a week of her arrival at the Duval plantation, the subtle corruption of the household environment began to manifest. The planter's wife reported that the mirrors in the grand parlor had developed a persistent cloud that no cloth could clear, and the grandfather clock in the hall began to chime at irregular intervals, often striking 13 times at the stroke of midnight. Henri Duval, a man of science and reason, dismissed these occurrences as humidity and mechanical failure, but he could not dismiss the change in his own temperament. He found himself waking in the dead of night, his heart pounding, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of his bed, watching him with a patience that felt geological in scale. The servants whispered among themselves in the kitchens, sharing rumors that Anne was not a new acquisition, but a returning force. They claimed that when she passed through the slave quarters, the air grew cold, and the candle flames bent toward her, as if in supplication. One elderly woman, a root worker named Mambo Laveau, recognized the spirit that walked beside the new servant. "She is not one," the old woman murmured to her followers. "She is many. She carries the weight of the ship and the chain." The network of resistance that Amara had contacted in Savannah was not a solitary thread, but a vast, invisible web, and Anne was simply a new spider, taking her position at the center of a different sector of the trap. Back in Georgia, the institutionalized remnants of the Vance line provided a grim coda to the tragedy. Silas Vance died in the Georgia Infirmary for the Insane in the winter of 1769. His official cause of death listed as a failure of the liver, though the attendants whispered that he had simply stopped breathing, his will to live extinguished by the memory of fire. Julian Vance, the son who had first perceived the truth, survived in a state of perpetual catatonia, sitting by a window that faced the river, his eyes wide and unseeing. He never spoke, but sometimes, during the thunderstorms that rolled in from the Atlantic, he would smile, a terrible, knowing expression that terrified the nurses who cared for him. The financial collapse of the three families was total and irreversible. The Sterling shipping fleet was auctioned off to creditors in Charleston, the ships renamed and repurposed, their former owners' crests scraped from the hulls. The Crowthorne lands were seized by the bank and sold to a northern consortium, breaking up the vast rice empire into smaller, unprofitable plots. The ledgers of the Georgia Bank and Trust for 1770 show a significant write-off of bad debt, specifically referencing the Vance-Sterling insolvency, a sterile phrase that encompassed the destruction of three dynasties and the death of the patriarchs who had built them. The money was gone, the names were ruined, and the lineage was severed. In New Orleans, Henri Duval began to exhibit the same symptoms of obsessive possession that had claimed Arthur Sterling. He found himself unable to focus on his sugar production, his mind consumed by the presence of the woman who moved silently through his home. He began to offer extravagant gifts to Anne, jewelry, fine dresses, and privileges usually reserved for free women of color. He believed he was courting her, unaware that he was merely digging his own grave with every gesture of affection. The pattern was repeating with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, a cycle of desire, pride, and inevitable destruction. A letter intercepted by a free black sailor in 1771 reveals the scope of the operation that Amara and her counterparts were conducting. The letter, written in a coded script that mixed French, Creole, and African dialects, was addressed to a woman named Sarah in Philadelphia. It contained a single stark phrase: "The harvest in Savannah is complete. The planting in New Orleans has begun." This correspondence proves that the destruction in Savannah was not an isolated incident of supernatural vengeance, but a coordinated campaign, a shadow war being fought in the parlors and bedrooms of the powerful across the colonies. The legend of Amara grew with each retelling, morphing into a myth that served the psychological needs of the oppressed. To the enslaved, she was not a murderer, but a liberator, a spirit of justice who proved that the master class was not invulnerable. They whispered her true name, though few knew it, as a talisman of protection. The story of the Vance Fire became a foundational text of resistance, a reminder that the peculiar institution of slavery carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. It was a lesson in the power of patience, a demonstration that time was on the side of those who waited with a purpose. On the anniversary of the fire, in the ruins of the Vance mansion, a strange phenomenon was reported by a night watchman. He claimed to see a woman walking the perimeter of the burnt foundation, her skin glowing like polished bronze in the moonlight. She paused, looked toward the spot where the carriage house had stood, and seemed to nod before vanishing into the darkness. The watchman, a man of little imagination, quit his post the next day, refusing to return to the site. Whether this was a hallucination or an authentic sighting remains a matter of local folklore. But the persistence of such stories indicates that Amara had transcended her physical form to become an enduring presence in the landscape. The narrative of Amara, Anne, and the countless other women who moved through the slaveholding society, like silent assassins, serves as a final, sobering counterpoint to the official histories of the era. They were not recorded in the probate records or the shipping manifests as agents of change, yet their impact was undeniable. The ruins of the Vance mansion stood for years as a testament to the fact that when a society builds its foundation on human suffering, it creates its own executioners. The debt is always due, and the collectors are already walking among the unsuspecting, waiting for the moment to present the bill.